long for fact-checkers to dissect or even detect. There's also been a shift in focus to the monitoring and reporting foreign influence operations and foreign information manipulation interference in a region where big powers such as the United States and China compete for dominance and where foreign entities seek to influence the outcome of national and even local elections. Now, we will present to you our preliminary findings. Journalists were stumped by the magnitude at which the disinformation operations during the 2016 election campaign flooded social media, prompting newsrooms to innovate and prepare for the succeeding election cycles. Despite our retooling efforts, however, journalistic institutions remained overwhelmed by the exponential rate at which disinformation is thriving due to the massive funds being poured toward disinformation actors and activities. It was about money. This, however, does not mean journalists were unable to pound dents into the formidable disinformation machinery in the country. During our key informant interviews, the interviewees coming out of various newsrooms described their experiences during the 2016 election cycle. This study found that while these journalists believed they were winning some major fronts in the war against disinformation, they also conceded massive losses. The responses in the interviews led to 5 themes that describe the hurdles they continue to face in fighting disinformation. 1, social media ecology. 2, editorial and corporate hurdles. 3, industry-wide skepticism. 4, political factors. And 5, innovation and retooling. These themes are the major descriptors of the factors interviewees cited as impediments in efforts within newsrooms and the whole journalism industry to combat disinformation. Let's start with disinformation chaos. A recurring verbalization among interviewees is how during the 2016 election cycle, they failed to anticipate the rate at which disinformation tainted social media platforms. One respondent believes that at this time, newsrooms have yet to fully formulate the concept of disinformation. We were still trying to make sense of that term. That was in 2016. Interviewees also believe that while newsrooms responded accordingly, the growth of disinformation networks outpaced the response of journalistic institutions. For example, in the 2019 and 2022 election cycles, when newsrooms were still skeptical of social media platforms outside the ones they were already using, disinformation actors were already capitalizing on this. Aside from this, newsrooms are also skeptical of the formats that launched TikTok to widespread use. When disinformation actors use these formats to spread misleading and false information, only then did they incorporate such formats and establish a presence on these platforms. Again, we were playing catch-up. A respondent who worked for the broadcast network said this was very evident in the 2022 election cycle, when audiences did not monitor television coverage of the election campaign based on ratings data. Instead, they went to social media to watch the influencers. Since one of social media's major functions is to share content, this has also blurred the lines between journalistic institutions and content creation, as the public can choose which materials to consume. This has led to the huge popularity of partisan political and monetized vloggers with no connections at all to mainstream news organizations. Here are some examples, which my colleague will discuss in greater detail. In short, more bad news coming from my colleague.
Okay, so based on our preliminary findings of the views of journalists in the last 3 election cycles, some newsrooms also do not incorporate fact-checking in their editorial policy. One of the interviewees admitted to the lack of a fact-checking team in their newsroom, and neither was fact-checking incorporated at all into their news company's business model. While some newsrooms are dedicated to fact-checking and some have created a fact-checking team, the lack of the lack of funding, no, uh, gives rise to undermanned fact-checking teams that are unable to cover a wide variety of disinformation that gets published and shared tenfold. For example, one newsroom only has 2 to 3 fact checkers at any given time. Uh, also a recurring theme is marketability and profitability. Content strategy is a concern among newsrooms. Strategies include the language used and the type of content produced. Newsrooms have shifted almost entirely to conversational Filipino instead of English, given the preferences of audiences for the former. News and fact checks are also being repurposed into more digestible short form videos for platforms such as Facebook Reels and TikTok. Okay, there's also industry-wide skepticism, no? Factors that leave much to be desired as far as commitment to fact-checking is concerned. We see a disjointed industry in terms of fact-checking policy. Interviewees cited how even some big newsrooms still refuse to start fact-checking operations, and the prevailing sentiments advocating for newsrooms to stick to battling disinformation through regular news reporting. There is an ongoing internal debate on whether newsrooms should have dedicated fact-checking teams. The first issue is cost. Fact-check teams are cost centers that do not have a clear revenue stream. The resources could be better spent on news gathering. It is assumed that reporters can fact-check data for their own stories. Second, is whether it's proper for newsrooms to do fact-check stories. A respondent from a print media organization said fact-checking should be done by standalone organizations, such as a news organization in the Philippines called Vera Files. Okay, some interviewees also believe that traditional journalistic practices and attitudes also hinder fact-checking efforts. These include skepticism towards fact-checking practices that call out figures as outright liars. Some interviewees also agree that journalists are not trained to quarrel with sources. Interviewees also believe that disjointed efforts of journalistic institutions are partly caused by the refusal of journalists to acknowledge external voices or opinions on the way they do things. Since there are differing views on how to deal with disinformation, and these are very apparent, the interviewees believe there's a need for journalistic institutions and those outside journalism to come together. We go to political factors. No? These factors refer to the prevailing social systems and how certain ideological influences of society have shaped perceptions of fact-checking. First is outgunned disinformation efforts. This is a recurring theme. No? Interviewees lamented how disinformation networks have more well-oiled machinery than those of the efforts than those who are engaged in efforts to fight it. This is because the funding being poured into disinformation towers over the allocation that newsrooms and fact-checkers are receiving. Another major challenge is in the political landscape is how people don't agree on what is fact. Interviewees lamented how the distrust towards the media has made facts arbitrary. The most recurrent names when asked about disinformation are Rodrigo Duterte and Bongbong Marcos, whose machineries have given rise to burgeoning disinformation malady in the country, how major political players in the country have operated disinformation networks to brandish their names, push their agenda, and derail those against them, has made convincing the greater public about what is fact very difficult, no, according to interviewees. Aside from these, some interviewees also cited the culture of impunity as a hindrance to fact-checking efforts. Next is innovation and retooling. These factors refer to areas in fact-checking and journalism that the interviewees improved upon and are still seeking to improve to to better their chances of fighting disinformation. First, a re-examination of journalism. Because of the current social media ecology and prevailing social-political climate, the interviewees believe there's a need to revisit the role of journalism in society. For one respondent, introducing new tools while journalists refuse to let go of the old ones is one of the toughest battles. Next, audience engagement. One response that newsrooms are looking into based on the responses of our interviewees is innovating ways to package fact checks in to make them more palatable. One of the interviewees cited the importance of engaging with the audience, seeking their opinion and seeking their help in fact-checking efforts. Next, partnerships and training. Interviewees also highlighted how the burgeoning disinformation problem has prompted many institutions to band together to promote and bolster fact-checking efforts. Training has also been made available not only to journalists and media workers but to everyday Filipinos. The overarching theme of this conference is creativity. The creativity discourse in journalism often centers on the intersection between creative writing and journalism and creative ways of gathering, analyzing, and presenting news and information. Our experience with journalism startups shows that creativity must go beyond content production and into business operations and therefore has ramifications on impact and sustainability. Here we present two cases, Press1.ph, a fact-checking organization, and Facts First, an independent digital media enterprise with a growing influence in the political discourse in the Philippines. Press1.ph was formed in mid-2019 by a group of journalists and communicators on the simple premise that if fake news sites and social media accounts multiplied by the day, there should be room for one more legitimate news website. So, the months leading to the 2022 presidential elections presented an opportunity to focus on fact-checking operations, and Press1.ph became one of 6 incubated fact-checkers funded by Internews, an international media development NGO. So Press1 also made 2 major fact-checking coalitions formed ahead of the 2022 elections, and it also became one of the 3 new verified signatories of the International Fact-Checking Network. So at Press1.ph, we have found that building a brand from the ground up is a difficult task that requires an enormous amount of time and financial resources. So is competing with news giants in the breaking news space. Eventually, Press1.ph found a niche in fact-checking with the help of coalitions and media development NGOs. The lesson here is that new players cannot simply adopt old business models and should explore more ways to generate resources to support their editorial objectives without compromising independence. And finally, Facts First Media. Facts First Media is an independent news organization at the forefront of the fight against disinformation in the Philippines. It began as a weekly podcast in 2020 and later expanded into a thriving platform for news, commentaries, and fact-checking. The main content is the nightly live episodes featuring in-depth discussions with political pundits, newsmakers, and policymakers. Facts First also offers weekly explainers, short documentaries, and commentaries. Since 2020, its audience has grown to at least 260,000 subscribers on YouTube and 56,000 followers on Facebook. The language used is predominantly conversational Filipino to reach a wider audience. In conclusion, Philippine newsrooms were caught off guard by the gravity of election-related disinformation online in 2016 and in succeeding elections. Most of them had little understanding of how best to deal with information manipulation and how disinformation networks worked. The problem became even more sophisticated and insidious during the 2019 and 2022 elections, and with AI now more widely used, it will get even worse. Many newsrooms had to retool, retrain, and reorient their traditional views of delivering the news, given that they were competing with a deluge of other information sources across online platforms. Sticking to what we knew was never going to work anymore. If in the past, mainstream news organizations dictated the news agenda, today we are but only among millions of voices competing for audiences' attention. Thus, we have to be more creative in our content creation, while maintaining our journalistic integrity. Jin Kuya.